In this video, we're going to talk about the ways we are going to structure the URIs to access resources on our web service. But first of all, let me tell you what I call URL and what I'm going to call URI. So on the screen, I have the complete URL address, which we can use to access first 50 users from our database. And the URL looks like this. We have HTTP, which is a protocol, and then we have subdomain www, and then we have the website address, domain name, and then we have URI, API/users, and after URI we have a query string, start from first and return me 50 users only. So if I'm reading the address which includes protocol, I'm going to call it URL. But if I'm talking about URI, I'm talking about the part which is in green. It starts with the / API users. And if I talk about query string, then I mean the question mark, start, and the request parameters which come after. So let's say we have a database table called users, which stores all users registered with our mobile application. And when user fills in the registration form, our mobile application needs to take these user details and needs to send them to a server-side script, which might be called something like register user details. And this script will take user details and it will store them in a database table called users. So what would be the URL to that register user server script part? So let's look at first a few examples. For example, traditionally or non-RESTful style, we would have a URI looking like this. We'll have / register user servlet, for example, or if it was a PHP script, we'll have register user.php. And this script will accept HTTP post request, and that HTTP post request will contain a JSON payload, which will have first name and last name and the values. But if we follow RESTful style, then the URI, the green part of it, will look something like this. We'll have / users, and then it will also accept HTTP post, and it will also accept the JSON payload. There is not much difference in between two, except that the RESTful style at this moment, it doesn't have any actions in it, like it doesn't have do register, or it doesn't have register, or it doesn't have a register new user, things like this. It's a very simple collection name, like we have users. If user is a resource, then collection of that resources is called users. So let's look at some other examples. For example, other HTTP methods or other operations that we can perform once we have one user recorded in our database. We can call get user details, we can perform update user details and delete user details and so on. So to get user details, traditionally, again, we would compose the URI this way. It will be called something like get user details servlet, and then the user ID that we want to, the ID of the resource that we want to return will be passed in as a query parameter. But if we look at the RESTful style, then it will look a little bit different. We'll have URI following / users, and then the ID of the resource that we want to return back will be sent as the path parameter, not as a query string in a traditional way with the question mark and then parameter name and the parameter value, but rather than as the part of that URI. The identifier of the resource that we want to return will be passed in as the path parameter. And let's look at other examples. For example, to delete user details, we will traditionally create a URI, something like delete user details servlet. And then again, the value or the ID of the resource that we want to delete will be sent in as a query parameter. And if we look at the RESTful style, the URI looks exactly the same, and what changes is just the HTTP method. To get user details, we will use HTTP get method, but to delete user details, we will use HTTP delete. Rather than traditionally, we will still perform the get HTTP method, but the action will be included in the script name or the URI path. So one of the differences between traditional and the RESTful, we do not include the action which we want to perform into the URI. Our URI stays simple, users / and then ID of the resource that we want to get or delete, but the action which we want to perform on that resource is specified in the HTTP method, whether we want to get it or delete it. Let's look at the example where we want to update user details. So traditionally, we will send HTTP post, and then we will have the name of the script, and then the data that we want to update will be sent as a JSON payload. And the ID of the resource which we want to update will be also included as a part of that JSON document. But if we look at the RESTful style, we're going to use HTTP put rather than HTTP post. URI will stay the same. It will be / users, and then ID of the user that we want to update, or the identifier of the resource that we want to update, and then the data which we want to be stored for this user. So note the difference. In the traditional way, we will send the ID of the resource that we want to update as part of the JSON document, and in the RESTful, ID will be still part of the URI and it will be sent as a path parameter, but the JSON document will not contain ID of the resource we are going to update. Let's look at the way we can get a list of all resources if we needed to. For example, to get a list of all users registered with our application, we would send HTTP GET request to a servlet called Get All Users servlet. And it looks very much different from the Get User Details servlet, where we needed to get details of a single user. But if we follow the RESTful approach, then our collection URI will look very much similar to the one we used to get a single user resource, except we do not provide the ID of the user that we want to return. So the URI to get all users will look like / users, and then if we wanted to get a specific user, we would just add the ID of that user, the ID of that resource we wanted to return. So this is the difference between getting a single resource and getting entire collection of resources. And the URI looks very much similar, and it looks very simple also. Now let's look at a bit longer URI examples. For example, we need to get all comments published in a specific message. So in a not RESTful style, we would do something like this. So we'll have get message comments, and then we'll have the query string sending in user ID and then the message ID. And we will get all comments under that message. But if we follow RESTful style, we will have HTTP GET request, and we will first refer to a collection of users, and then specific user, and then collection of messages, and then a specific message, and then all comments under that message. So you see, it's a little bit more readable and a little bit more predictable. Let's look at another example where we need to get a comment, a specific comment under that message. So in a traditional way, we will again send in user ID and then message ID, and then we will need to provide a comment ID. But if we follow the RESTful style, we will send HTTP GET request, and then we will follow through a users, collection of users, and then get specific user, and then messages, and we get a specific message, and then comments, and then the resource of a specific comment by providing ID as a path parameter rather than a query string. And if we look at the two ways of accessing resources, we will see that the RESTful style is really much more simpler, is predictable, and is much more readable for users, and it's much more easy to remember this way of accessing resources. And here I have a few naming tips. For example, the very first one is we use nouns as opposed to verbs or actions. An example will be users rather than get users, so we take action out of the URI name. And we use plurals when we are naming collections. For example, I have a collection of users here, and if I wanted to get a specific resource, a specific user from that collection, I would have a URI users plural / and then identifier of that specific user, rather than having a resource URI called user/1. So the collection doesn't have the plural in it. It doesn't say that there are many users. And then we should try as much as possible make our URIs predictable. For example, to get a collection of all messages, I would follow the URI users/specific user and then /messages of that user, rather than users/specific user and then published messages. So all of a sudden, the collection name is not just messages, but published messages. Or in this example, good collection URI will look like users, a specific user, messages, a specific message, and then a collection of likes, rather than published messages and then with a specific message, and then all of a sudden it became all likes, rather than simply a collection of likes, rather than simply likes. So please avoid this published messages or all likes, and follow as much as possible this very simple pattern where we have user as a resource, and if it's a collection of users, we call it users.